40 years earlier, June 1944, the sound was not a beep. It was the clatter of tracks, the hydraulic moan of a turret, and the nervous laughter of men who were not yet ghosts. Captain Arthur Merrick stood in the Sherman Firefly's open hatch and tasted morning in the hedgerows. He had learned the smell of France quickly: crushed nettle, damp earth, and cordite that ran like a fine thread through all the green. The Firefly's long 17-pounder gun jutted like a conducting baton through the lanes, and the tank followed it, obedient and loud. Inside, his driver, Gibbs, hummed to settle his hands. The loader, Shaw, tapped the toe of his boot under a crate of armor-piercing rounds. Youngest was Fletcher, the radio op, who had not yet learned that fear is not the opposite of courage, but its fuel. "Eyes up," Merrick said, not unkindly. He had the voice of a patient teacher and the posture of a man who could lift a door off its hinges if he had to. His face had the handsome ordinariness of a pre-war school photograph: neat hair, level mouth, eyes that did not give themselves away. The only vanity he permitted was a silver cigarette case tucked into his breast pocket with his wife's initials engraved inside. EM for Eleanor Merrick, who wrote every Wednesday and always began, "My dearest Arthur, the roses are late this year and the bus is still unreliable." They'd landed in the second wave. They had pushed past beaches and bayonets, through villages that cheered them with faces both shining and hollow, and then into the bocage, those ancient hedges that turned Normandy's fields into a maze designed to ambush the modern. The Firefly was a promise and a provocation. It could kill big cats, panthers, and tigers with a shot that sang. But if it was seen first, its thin side armor made it a grave. Merrick's map case smelled of pencil shavings and rain. He had traced their route in neat, unshowy lines, annotated for hedgerow gaps that might admit a turret without tearing off the wireless aerial. The mission today was a simple cruelty: advance to a ridge beyond the village of St. Bertin, hold until the infantry crossed, and if God and luck conspired, live to smoke the end of a cigarette he had lit that morning, left hedge breaks. In 20, Fletcher reported, voice clipped by the headset, could be a sunken lane beyond. Gibbs, Merrick said, ease her, Shaw. Mind the ammo, Knox will need our ears. The hedgerow broke reluctantly, revealing a lane like a scar across the land, deep enough to swallow a jeep whole. The Firefly's nose tipped down, then up, the hull creaking as if complaining in an old man's voice. Merrick scanned ahead through binoculars. The fields beyond lay in a deceptive, gentle roll, dotted with hayricks and the broken spines of apple trees, their limbs white with dust. Hold, he said, in the quiet. The war seemed to lean back, listening. Then the first shot came not at them, but close enough to call their souls to attention. A plume of earth rose 30 yards off the bow, square and violent. The report came late, the echo a slap around the hedges. Panzer to our 1 o'clock, Fletcher hissed. Range can't see, sir. Merrick's brain moved without friction. Traverse right steady. Loader, AP. Driver, inch us forward. Let him think we're nervous. Loaded, Shaw said, the word firmed by training. The long shell slid home. The 17-pounders breached shut with a fat, satisfying click. There you are, Merrick murmured, as the Panther offered him a narrow angle through a gap in straw. It was too perfect a hunter's window. He didn't take it. Hold, he said again, lower now, not to the crew but to his own blood. He wanted more flank, a cleaner plate. Impatience kills good crews. He could hear his gunnery instructor's voice over the English rain. A live coward kills more cats than a dead hero. The panther twitched. The gap vanished. Forward, Merrick snapped. Now go. Gibbs dropped the clutch. The firefly lurched, and the hedgerow's thorns screamed. Across the paint. The second shot hit the hedge behind them and exploded leaves into confetti. Merrick's world shrank to barrel, breath, and timing. Hold fire. The firefly's gun cracked, the recoil rocking 30 tons, as if it were a skiff. Across the field, something impossible happened to the panther's posture. Pride left it. Black smoke poured out like a confession. Hit. Shah whooped fool's joy in his throat. Down, Merrick said, already scanning left. Big cats rarely hunt alone. For the next 9 minutes, time existed only as angles and distances. The crew moved like a machine thinking with 5 minds. By the end of it, the field was a lesson in geometry and grief. 2 wrecks, burning, an orchard pocked with holes the size of bathtubs, and a silence that felt too large for the hedgerows to hold. Status, Merrick said, as if ordering tea. Green. Gibbs panted. All green. Good, Merrick said, and only then allowed his hands to shake once, briefly, where the crew could not see Dot. They pushed to the ridge by evening. Infantry flowed past like a tide around a rock. A sergeant with a dirty bandage on his forearm slapped the firefly's flank and grinned. Merrick lifted a hand in reply, the gesture small, almost embarrassed. The sun went down on the same script it performs for men who die and men who write letters home. Heedless of either. Night made a different animal of the war. The world contracted to the tank's warm belly, the mercury glow of dials, cigarette tips like red insects. Gibbs dozed in 3-minute stitches. Shaw wrote a note that would never be posted. Fletcher traced a girl's name in the dust on the floor and wiped it away. Merrick climbed out to stand in the hatch with the sky for company. He could smell rain gathering behind the clouds. He took the silver case from his pocket and read Eleanor's last lines by torchlight, careful to shield it with his hand. My dearest Arthur, the bus is still unreliable, and Mrs. Downs says the grocer is saving real eggs for people with babies. I told her you always liked the yolk a little runny, and she said soldiers shouldn't be allowed such luxuries, even in theory. He smiled. The smallest human things did the most work to keep men alive. A rustle came from the hedgerow, not animal, not wind. Merrick's head turned before his mind did. He clicked the safety off his sidearm by touch alone. Who goes? He said, not loud enough to teach the night their position. A figure detached from the hedge. A runner. British breath, sawing mud up his shins. He thrust a folded message up with the posture of a man who had not enjoyed his errand. From brigade. Sir, new orders, immediate. Merrick took it, the paper soft from sweat. He read, then read again. The words stiff and bureaucratic and somehow terrible because of it. Redeploy, east. 0200. Recon by fire. Intelligence reports, armored elements. In withdrawal, Haraskat disappear. He felt his jaws set. Disappears if men were ink. Very well, he said. Tell them we're a watch that keeps good time. The runner snorted something like a laugh and vanished back into the hedge. Merrick slid into the turret. Roused the lads. What's the word? Shaw yawned. We go hunting, Merrick said, hating the word. 2 hours. He folded Eleanor's letter and returned it to the case. For a moment, he let his fingers rest on the metal. The way a man touches a talisman he doesn't quite believe in, but doesn't dare doubt. Then he reached for the intercom switch. Gentlemen, he said to a crew he loved in the particular way that men love those who might die with them. Let's be ghosts. In 1984, the forest accepted the winch with the lethargy of an old wound being reopened. Chains clinked, a diesel coughed. The whole side upward through mud with the sound of a ship coming up from a dark harbor. Roots snapped like violin strings. The turret face lifted into the light, and moss sloughed from the welded seams in green tears. When the glacis was free enough to show its scars, Luke wiped away slime and found stenciled letters beneath, flaked, stubborn, and still legible after. For decades, a -23, Eleanor, ATN, felt his throat tighten. He placed a photograph of younger, sunlit Mericon the tank's skin as if returning a soul to a body. Call the Mary, Luke said softly. Call the historian in Cannes. Call whoever you call when something like this stops being a rumor. ATN nodded but didn't move. He was staring at the driver's visor, a narrow slit like a tired eye, and from somewhere he could not name came the childish thought that something might look back. The forest exhaled. A breeze ran, its fingers through the canopy. For the first time since the first beep, Etienne understood what they had woken. Not a wreck, a story. One that had waited 40 years in the dark, quiet as steel, patient as roots, and heavy with the question that turns men into searchers. How did a captain named for his wife disappear with his tank named for his wife, and leave both their names behind? He closed the satchel. We call everyone, he said, because this is going to shock people. And somewhere under soil, still clinging to hull seams, something small shifted and clicked, no more than a buckle releasing, or a diarist's swollen spine relaxing to the air. But Etienne would swear, later, that he heard it as a voice, at last. The winter of 1945 had ended, but the silence surrounding the disappearance of Captain Eric Weiss and his Panther tank crew had not lifted. Entire villages in eastern Poland whispered about the armored machine that had seemingly vanished into thin air during one of the bloodiest retreats of the war. On official paper, the German command listed Eric Weiss as missing in action, but in the months that followed, the story began to twist. In the small farming village of Brzozowka, near the dense forests where Weiss's division last fought, old peasants claimed to have heard metallic thunder echoing long after the front line had passed. A woman named Aniela, who was just a teenager at the time, swore she saw a dark shape moving through the fog one evening, the outline of a tank, crawling slowly, its engine choking and sputtering. But by the time Soviet patrols combed the area, there was nothing. To the locals, it became more than a missing tank. It became a ghost. They whispered about the steel beast that prowls at night. The family's desperation back in Stuttgart, Eric's wife Elise refused to accept the bland telegram of missing. She believed her husband was alive, perhaps captured, perhaps wounded, but not gone. She wrote dozens of letters to the Red Cross, to Allied POW camps, even to Soviet officials seeking any trace. Each reply was the same. No record of Captain Eric Weiss. Her youngest daughter, Clara, barely 6 years old, would ask at bedtime, "Mummy, when will Papa drive his big tank home?" Elise had no answer. By the late 1940s, when Germany lay in ruins and the world moved on, Elise still kept a framed photo of Eric in uniform, stern, proud, with a half-smile that now felt like a taunt. A rumor among soldiers then came an unsettling account. In 1947, a Polish veteran named Jan Kowalski, who had served with Soviet forces, spoke of a strange encounter. His unit had been ordered to secure a valley after the war, an area riddled with half-sunken bunkers and rusting vehicles. While clearing the forest, they stumbled upon fresh tank tracks. The pattern was unmistakable, German Panzer tracks, but they were new, pressed into soft earth just days earlier. Impossible, Jan said. By then, no German armor remained operational. When they followed the trail deeper into the marsh, it ended abruptly, as though the machine had simply disappeared. His comrades joked it must be a ghost tank, but Jan never laughed. He insisted until his death that there had been something unnatural in those woods. The searchers of the 1960 SBY, the 1960s, as Europe tried to rebuild its scars, small groups of amateur historians and battlefield relic hunters began revisiting forgotten sites. One such group, led by a man named Dieter Schreiber, had heard whispers of a missing Panther tank near Brzozowka. They interviewed locals, now older, their memories fading, but still haunted. One elderly farmer claimed that in 1944, he saw a German commander step out of his tank, clutching a map, before disappearing into the forest and never returning. Another woman insisted she heard cries in German echoing from beneath the earth, as though a tank and its crew had been swallowed alive. The relic hunters searched with metal detectors and crude digging tools, but the forest gave up nothing. The soil was soft, treacherous, prone to sinkholes. They concluded the tank must have sunk deep into the marshlands, buried beyond reach. But then came a chilling twist. The letter in 1969, a listener still keeping hope alive, received an anonymous letter, postmarked from Gdańsk, Poland. It contained only a few lines written in shaky German. Your husband fought bravely. His tank lies where earth drinks iron. They did not die quickly. No name, no return address. Just that Elise wept. For days, clutching the paper. Clara, now grown into a young woman, read it over and over, trying to imagine what earth drinks iron could mean. For the first time, they considered the possibility that Eric and his men had not died instantly, but suffered trapped in their steel coffin beneath the marsh. A nation divided by the 1970s. Cold War tensions made such searches nearly impossible. Poland, under Soviet influence, treated Western inquiries into wartime wreckage with suspicion. For outsiders like Dieter and his group, traveling to the forests near Brzozowka meant constant eyes watching, constant questions asked. But still, rumors persisted. Truck drivers swore they saw pieces of tank armor sticking out of bog water. After floods, children told tales of a giant shadow beneath the river mud, shaped like a beast sleeping dot to the villagers. It was no longer just a war relic. It was a curse. Some avoided that part of the forest entirely, believing the souls of the crew still lingered, restless. Beneath the soil, the family's burden by 1980, Elise was frail, her health failing. On her deathbed, she pressed her daughter, Clara's hand. You must find him, she whispered. Don't let your father be lost forever. Those words carved themselves into Clara's heart. For nearly 4 decades, she had grown up under the shadow of absence, an invisible father, a story unfinished. Now, she carried the responsibility. After Elise's passing, Clara began her own search. She scoured archives, wartime records, and whispered testimonies. She wrote to veterans, visited Poland in secret, and pieced together a picture of Eric Weissnot, just as a soldier, but as a man swallowed by history. Then, in 1984, Clara received a phone call that would change everything. A team of forestry workers near Brzozowka, while draining part of a swamp for logging roads, uncovered something metallic. At first, they thought it was construction debris, but as the water level dropped, a curved plate of thick armor emerged. Covered in mud and reeds, a panther tank. Word spread quickly. Local officials tried to suppress it, but photographs leaked. The massive turret, half submerged, like the skull of some prehistoric beast rising from the earth. For Clara, it was the sin she had waited for her whole life. Her father's final resting place had been found, but as excavators prepared to pull the tank free, villagers warned them, "Do not disturb it. The ghosts will not forgive you." Foreshadowing the horror, Clara ignored the superstition. She flew to Poland immediately, determined to stand where her father had vanished. But nothing could prepare her for what would be revealed once the tank was raised from the swamp. Because inside, sealed in the rusting steel chamber, lay not just relics of war but a chilling story that no one had expected. The year was 1945. The war was drawing to a close. Yet for families like that of Commander Heinrich Falk, the silence was deafening. Weeks had stretched into months since his last transmission, and though Germany was crumbling, his family clung to hope. Somewhere in the Eastern Front, beyond the forests of Poland and the marshes of Belarus, Heinrich had vanished, swallowed by the fog of war. His wife Anna remembered his last letter. The ink had smudged from tears as she reread it, night after night. "We are moving east, Anna. I feel the tide turning. If fate allows, I will see you again. Tell our son that his father carries him in his heart always." But fate had been cruel. As the Allies pushed deeper, entire tank divisions were wiped out in brutal ambushes. Villages were flattened, and soldiers who survived often disappeared into the wilderness, never to return. Some were captured, others deserted. But Falk was different, respected, disciplined, and not the kind to run. So when his unit was listed as missing in action, rumors spread among survivors. Some whispered of an ambush in a dense forest, where Soviet anti-tank units lay in wait. Others claimed Falk's tank had rolled into a swamp, vanishing beneath the murky waters. And then there were darker stories. A handful of villagers swore they had seen something. A tank wreckage hidden in the woods, half buried with strange symbols scratched across its hull. But when the Red Army swept the region, those whispers were silenced. The forgotten battlefield. By 1950, the war was over, the world was rebuilding. And yet Falk's name lived in a strange limbo, neither among the dead nor the living. His brother Karl could not let go. Unlike others who accepted the mystery, Karl became obsessed. He pored over war records, maps, and survivor testimonies. One night, sitting in the dim light of a lantern, Karl traced a map of Belarus with shaking fingers. If Heinrich vanished anywhere, it was here, he muttered, his eyes fixed on a cluster of forests, marked as heavy combat zones. But there was a problem. The area was still dangerous, strewn with mines, wreckage, and occupied by locals who mistrusted outsiders. Even Soviet soldiers rarely ventured into the deepest parts of those woods. Yet Karl's conviction only grew. Something had happened to his brother in that forest, and he intended to find it. Ghost stories of the villagers. By the late 1960s, decades had passed, yet the forest still held secrets. Travelers spoke of rusted hulks of tanks swallowed by moss and trees. Hunters told stories of hearing metallic groans at night, like engines trying to start, deep beneath the soil. And in one village near the edge of the forest, elders claimed that on foggy nights they could hear German voices echoing faintly, shouting orders that no one understood anymore. To outsiders, it was superstition. But to those who had lived through the war, it was memory. It wasn't until 1982, nearly 40 years after Heinrich's disappearance, that the first real lead surfaced. A team of amateur historiansmen who scoured Eastern Europe searching for lost relics came across something strange. While trekking through a swampy clearing, one of them tripped over what seemed like a chunk of steel protruding from the ground. At first, they thought it was debris, but as they dug, their excitement grew. It was not just steel, it was the armor, plating of a tank. The men exchanged nervous glances. If this was what they thought it was, they had stumbled upon a relic frozen in time. Word spread quickly, eventually reaching Karl. When he heard the news, he knew instantly this could be Heinrich. The journey back in 1983, Karl, now an aging man with silver hair, made the journey to Belarus. The air was thick with memories, the forests unchanged, as if the war still lingered in their shadows. Guided by locals, he reached the site. What he saw took his breath away. Half buried in the soil, covered in moss and vines, was the silhouette of a Panzer IV tank. Its turret jutted upward, rusted but unmistakable. Trees had grown around it, their roots gripping the steel like skeletal fingers. Time had tried to erase it, but the forest had preserved it like a tomb. Whispers of the past. As Karl stood before the wreckage, he felt a chill. The silence of the woods pressed heavily, broken only by the distant cry of a crow. One of the historians pointed to the hatch. It was sealed shut. Karl's heart pounded. If this was Heinrich's tank, then perhaps, just perhaps, the truth still lay inside. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Opening it could reveal the past, but it could also disturb something that was better left untouched. Yet Karl insisted. "We open it," he said firmly. What they found with crowbars and effer, the rusted hatch creaked open. The smell hit them first. Stale, suffocating air, trapped for decades. Inside, shadows, and then, as their eyes adjusted, they saw them. The skeletal remains of the crew. 4 men, still in their uniforms, slumped in eternal silence. Helmets rusted, dog tags glinting faintly in the dim light. Karl's breath caught. His brother's face was gone 2 times, but the insignia, the personal effects, it was him. Commander Heinrich Falk had been found. But as the men searched further, something else came to light. Carved into the inner walls of the tank was strange. Marks, not battle notes, not messages, symbols, circles, lines, almost ritualistic carvings etched into the steel. What had happened in that final moment? Why had the men carved those shapes as death closed in? The discovery raised more questions than it answered. A legend is born. News of the find spread across Europe. Newspapers carried the story. Lost commander's tank unearthed after 40 years. But alongside the headlines came the whispers. Some claimed the crew had been trapped, slowly suffocating, and carved symbols in desperation. A last attempt at prayer. Others believed something darker, that the forest itself had swallowed them, and the carvings were an attempt to keep something out. Karl, holding his brother's dog tags in trembling hands, could not shake the feeling that the forest was watching, that perhaps Heinrich's soul had never truly left. That night, Karl stayed in a small village near the site. As he lay awake, he heard the low rumble of engines, distant, fading in and out of the mist. He rushed to the window, but the road was empty. Only the forest loomed, shrouded in fog. The past was not gone. It lingered, waiting, and Karl knew he was only scratching the surface of a mystery that went far deeper than anyone imagined. The war had left scars across Europe, not all of them visible. Bombed-out cities had been rebuilt, and life pressed forward. But there were still places where the ghosts of 1944 lingered. Remote forests, valleys, and ridges still carried wreckage. But the land itself seemed reluctant to give back. It was into one such place that a small team of amateur historians and veterans, descendants, ventured in the summer of 1984. Their mission was straightforward. At least on paper, survey the forests near the Ardennes, searching for remnants of the last great battles of World War II. What they found, however, was anything but ordinary. The expedition begins. The heart of the team was Peter Müller, a German historian who had spent years studying the Ardennes campaign. His father had fought in the Wehrmacht, and though Peter carried no pride for that, he felt a responsibility to uncover the truth of what had happened in those frozen forests. Alongside him was Colonel James Hartley Rhett, an American veteran of Vietnam, whose father had fought in Europe during the war and had gone missing near the Ardennes in late 1944. Their group also included a handful of young volunteers, students, eager to be part of something meaningful, and two Belgian locals who knew the terrain well. The forest greeted them with an eerie silence. Even in the bright heat of summer, there was a heaviness to the place. Old trees bent inward, their branches intertwining like a cathedral ceiling. Broken stone walls, half buried in moss, hinted at structures long lost. Every few steps, someone would stumble across rusted shell casings or twisted metal, silent reminders of a war for decades gone, clues in the earth on their third day of searching. The team stumbled across something unusual. One of the Belgian guides, Luke, noticed the ground in a clearing didn't sit naturally. It was slightly raised, as if the earth itself had been disturbed long ago and never settled properly. They began digging carefully. Within an hour, their shovels struck something solid, rusted steel. The volunteers exchanged wide-eyed glances as more of the buried object came into view. Slowly, unmistakably, the form of a tank began to emerge from the soil. Its gun barrel, corroded but still intact, jutted out like a skeletal finger pointing toward the sky. It wasn't just any tank. The armor, the angles, the shape of the turret. Peter recognized it immediately, a Panzer for the workhorse of the German armored divisions. But how had it ended up here? Deep in a forest valley, half buried as though the earth itself had tried to hide it. Over the following days, the team carefully unearthed the tank. The more they revealed, the stranger the discovery became. The Panzer had not been destroyed in combat. There were no shell holes, no signs of catastrophic damage. Instead, it seemed as though it had been deliberately abandoned and left to the elements. Inside the tank, after forcing open the rusted hatch, they found remnants of uniforms, canteens, and equipment scattered across the floor. There were no bones inside, no immediate sign of what had become of its crew. But one object in particular sent chills through the group. A leather satchel, preserved surprisingly well, was wedged between the gunner's seat and the wall. Inside were a handful of documents, field maps, orders stamped with German insignia, and most haunting of all, a set of letters written in a careful hand. The name on the letters matched one of the crew members Peter had long studied in his research, Lieutenant Karl Hoffmann, the Panzer commander who had vanished in 1944. The letters were brief, written in hurried strokes. They described exhaustion, dwindling supplies, and a creeping sense of doom as Hoffman and his crew navigated through hostile territory in the final months of the war. One note in particular stood out, dated December 18th, 1944. "We cannot hold the line. The roads are blocked. The sky belongs to them, and every night the forest grows colder. The men look to me for guidance, but I no longer know where to lead them. If this tank becomes our coffin, may whoever finds it one day know that we fought not for glory, but simply to survive the storm." The words struck the team silent. For Peter, it was the missing piece of a puzzle he had chased for years. For Colonel Hartley, it was something different. A glimpse into the humanity of an enemy soldier. Someone not unlike his own father, who had disappeared in these same woods. Whispers of the missing but questions remained. If the Panzer had not been destroyed, and the crew had not died inside, then where had they gone? Luke, the Belgian guide, recalled childhood stories of shepherds who had seen German soldiers wandering the valleys in the winter of 1944, ragged, starving, and far from any supply lines. Some were said to have begged food from villagers. Others simply vanished into the forest, never to be seen again. The possibility loomed heavy. Had Hoffman and his crew abandoned their machine and fled into the woods, only to succumb to the cold, hunger, or worse? That evening, around a fire at their camp, one of the older villagers shared a tale passed down through generations. He spoke of a ghost patrol that haunted the valley, 5 figures in faded uniforms, carrying lanterns that never went out, wandering the ridges in endless silence. Shepherds who strayed too far claimed to hear German voices in the night, muttering orders no one could understand. The weight of discovery over the next days, the group documented everything. Photographs of the Panzer, copies of Hoffman's letters, maps of the site, all carefully catalogued. The discovery would make waves in both Germany and Belgium once news spread. But for Peter and Hartley, it was personal. Peter stood by the rusted tank one evening, his hand resting on the cold steel. "My father always told me that history is never truly buried," he whispered. "But I never thought it would feel like this. To touch it, to stand here where they stood." Hartley nodded quietly. "My father fought men like Hoffman. Maybe he even faced him. But tonight, I don't see an enemy. I see a man who was lost, just like mine." The road ahead, the discovery of the Panzer, was just the beginning. Hoffman's letters hinted at something more. A planned rendezvous point, a safe place somewhere deeper in the forest where he had intended to lead his men. For Peter, it was clear what came next. If they could follow Hoffman's final trail, perhaps they could uncover the fate of the missing commander and his crew. The forest, however, would not give up its secrets easily. The maps were vague, the landmarks faded, and time itself had worked hard to erase the trail. But the letters had opened a door, and none of them could turn back now. As the team packed their gear, ready to push deeper into the Ardennes, the air around them grew colder, as though the forest itself was listening. Somewhere in those dark ridges, the answers waited, along with something none of them could yet imagine. The year was 1984. In a remote, wooded region of Eastern Europe, the ground trembled as construction crews prepared to clear an overgrown field for a new logging route. Bulldozers clawed into the earth, carving a path where moss-covered trees had stood untouched for decades. To the workers, it was just another job. But beneath the soil they were disturbing lay a secret buried since the darkest days of the Second World War. As the machines pressed forward, one of the operators suddenly felt his blade scrape against something solid. At first, he thought it was bedrock. But when the mud peeled back, he saw the unmistakable edge of rusted steel. The site supervisor halted the work. The men gathered around, their boots sinking into the damp earth, staring down at a jagged metal surface emerging like the skeletal remains of some giant creature. A worker crouched closer, brushing away wet soil with his bare hands. What appeared was not a rock, nor an ordinary piece of machinery, but the turret of a tank. Whispers of history word spread quickly through the small nearby village. Elderly men, who as children had lived through the chaos of 1944, shuffled to the site with canes in hand. They peered at the relic as if recognizing an old scar. One man swore he remembered hearing gunfire in those woods during the war, when Soviet and German forces clashed in a desperate struggle. Another muttered about a tank that never returned, swallowed by the swamp after a final, defiant stand by the time local officials arrived. The story had already taken on the weight of legend. Was this the missing vehicle from that battle? And if so, what had become of the commander who led it? The extraction pulling a tank from the earth was no small task. For days, engineers and recovery teams worked with cranes, chains, and pumps. The ground had swallowed the machine nearly whole. Its gun barrel protruded at an eerie angle, like a finger pointing toward the sky. Mud clung stubbornly to its hull, as if the forest itself refused to let go. When the first chains snapped under the strain, onlookers whispered that the earth did not want the secret revealed. But persistence won out. Inch by inch, the steel beast rose from its muddy tomb. Children clung to the fences watching, while old veterans stood in solemn silence. The tank emerged coated in rust, but remarkably intact. The insignia of its army, though faded, was still visible. A Soviet T-34 76, one of the most iconic tanks of the war. But the real question still lingered. Was anyone inside? The opening of the hatch, the recovery crew moved with a mix of caution and reverence. Cutting torches hissed as they pried open the sealed hatch. Rust flaked away in showers, filling the air with the acrid scent of burned metal. When the hatch finally groaned open, silence fell. The crowd pressed forward, but no one dared breathe. A flashlight beam pierced the darkness of the interior. Inside, the outlines of helmets and uniforms were unmistakable. The crew was still there. Time had turned them to little more than skeletal remains, but their positions told a chilling story. One man slumped forward over the controls, hands still frozen on the levers. Another rested near the machine gun port, his bones cloaked in the tattered remains of a Soviet uniform. And in the commander's seat, partially collapsed against the steel wall, was the figure of the officer who had led them into battle. His identification tag still dangled from his chest. It read, Commander Alexei Petrov, the forgotten hero for the villagers. It was as if the dead had finally spoken. For 4 decades, the fate of Commander Petrov and his crew had been a mystery. A ghost story told in hushed voices by those who remembered the thunder of artillery in their youth. Now, the truth lay in front of them, preserved in the iron coffin of a tank that refused to surrender to time. Newspapers caught wind of the discovery, and soon journalists flooded the area. Cameras clicked, reporters scribbled notes, and headlines announced the unearthed war relic. The world wanted to know, who was Alexei Petrov? Why had his tank been abandoned here, swallowed by the swamp? And what had been his final mission? Military historians were quick to involve themselves. Records were pulled from dusty archives, revealing fragments of a story. Commander Petrov, it turned out, had been only 27 years old in in 1944, a rising officer. He had earned respect among his men for his calm under fire. His unit had been tasked with a critical mission during the Soviet push against German forces, holding a key road long enough for reinforcements to arrive. But the battle had been fierce. Petrov's tank was last seen charging into enemy fire, its gun blazing, shielding retreating infantry with its final shells. Then nothing. The official report listed the vehicle as destroyed, the crew missing in action, but the recovery in 1984 told a different story. Petrov's tank had not been destroyed, had been trapped. Perhaps the ground beneath gave way. Perhaps the retreat and chaos of battle forced the army to leave it behind. Whatever the reason, Petrov and his crew were left to vanish in the forest, their sacrifice unrecorded, their story buried along with their steel companion. The emotional fallout for Petrov's surviving family. The discovery was both devastating and healing. His younger sister, Natalia, was now an elderly woman, her hair silver, her hands trembling as she received the news. She had last seen her brother in 1944, when he kissed her forehead and promised he would return home after victory. For decades, she had wondered if he had defected, been captured, or simply disappeared into the fog of war. Now she finally had her answer. When Natalia was escorted to the site, villagers stepped aside in reverent silence. She stood before the tank, her eyes filling with tears, her frail hands brushing against the cold steel. For her, this was not just a machine, it was her brother's grave. A memorial born, the discovery set in motion a wave of remembrance. The tank was cleaned, restored as best as possible, and placed on display in a war memorial near the village. Flowers were laid at its base. Veterans saluted. Children listened wide-eyed as stories were told of the young commander who had fought to the last breath. But even as the tank stood proudly in its new resting place, questions still lingered. Why had the site been forgotten for so long? And had Commander Petrov's sacrifice been deliberately erased from history, or simply lost in the chaos of war? The whispers of conspiracy grew louder. The year was 1983, and in a small, crumbling farmhouse on the border of France and Germany, a farmer's spade struck something metallic beneath the soil. At first, he thought it was the rusted remains of old farm equipment, but when he brushed the earth away, his hands trembled. A twisted fragment of steel, a corroded hatch, and beneath it, a glimpse of camouflage paint still clinging to the surface. The war had ended nearly 4 decades ago, but the land still whispered of the battles that once scarred it. The farmer, realizing the magnitude of what he had found, reported it immediately. Soon after, a group of historians and military archaeologists arrived at the site, led by Dr. Reinhard Keller, a man obsessed with World War II mysteries. As their excavation began, it became clear they had uncovered a German Panther tank, half buried in the earth, sealed by time. And inside, perhaps, the final answers to a mystery that had haunted families for generations. The unearthed steel beast crowds gathered as the tank was slowly pulled from its muddy tomb. Its armor was dented, its turret frozen mid-rotation, as though locked in battle, even in death. Onlookers marveled at how intact it was, preserved by the soil. But what sent chills through everyone present was the sealed hatch. The archaeologists hesitated. This wasn't just a machine, it was a tomb. And when they finally pried the hatch open, the air turned heavy. Inside, the skeletal remains of a soldier still sat in the commander's seat. The insignia on the tattered uniform confirmed it. This was the long-lost tank of Commander Heinrich Adler. the man whose disappearance in 1944 had baffled his comrades and haunted his family for decades. The discovery spread across Europe like wildfire. Newspapers called it the ghost tank of Lorraine. But this was no ordinary discovery. Inside the tank, tucked beneath the rusting equipment, was a leather satchel that had somehow survived the years. Inside it lay Adler's field journal, the journal of a vanished commander. The journal's pages, yellowed and brittle, revealed Adler's final days. His writing was steady at first. Tactical notes, map sketches, coordinates, but as the entries progressed, his words grew more frantic, filled with a creeping sense of paranoia. One passage read, "We have been cut off. The others believe we can break through, but I know the enemy is everywhere. I see movement in the trees at night, shadows watching us. Even in silence, I hear them." Another, "The men ask why I keep us hidden, why we wait instead of charging forward. They do not understand. Something follows us, something more than men." The final entry was scrawled with shaking hands. "If we do not make it out, may whoever finds this know it was not the enemy that took us. It was something else. The forest itself hides them. We are not alone here." The chilling words cast the mystery of Adler's disappearance into a far stranger light. Was it the chaos of war that had doomed his crew? Or had they encountered something inexplicable in the forests of Lorraine? The sisters, long vigilous of the tank's discovery, reached Adler's younger sister, Greta, now an elderly woman. Living in Munich for 40 years, she had kept his photograph on her mantle, refusing to accept that he had simply vanished without a trace. When she heard his remains had finally been found, she broke down in tears, but insisted on traveling to the excavation site. When Greta arrived, she laid her frail hand on the cold steel of the Panther tank and whispered, "Now you can come home, Heinrich." But when the archaeologists showed her the journal, she grew pale. She recognized her brother's handwriting instantly, yet the words inside, she struggled to believe. He was a rational man, a commander. He did not speak of ghosts, she said. If he wrote this, then something truly terrified him. For Greta, the journal brought both closure and torment. She finally knew where her brother had died. But the unanswered questions lingered. Echoes of war military experts examined the tank and its surroundings. They noted that the vehicle showed no signs of catastrophic damage, no shell impacts, no evidence of an ambush. Instead, it seemed as though the crew had simply stopped, sealed themselves inside, and never left. Even more unsettling, Adler's remains were alone. The other 4 crew members were missing. No bodies, no graves, nothing. Where had they gone? Some speculated they had abandoned the tank in panic, only to perish in the surrounding woods. Others suggested deserters, vanishing into civilian life. But then why had Adler stayed behind? And why had he written about shadows and the forest hiding them? Theories spread rapidly, fueled by the strange atmosphere of the site. Some locals claimed that part of the forest near the discovery was cursed, that during the war entire units had disappeared there without explanation. Folklore merged with fact, and the story of Commander Adler began to take on a legend of its own. The missing crew, in an effort to trace the fate of Adler's men, Dr. Keller and his team combed through wartime records. They found that the Panther tank had indeed been listed as missing in action during the autumn of 1944, but the names of the crewmen were still marked as unaccounted for. No reports of capture, no Red Cross records, no graves registered. It was as though they had simply evaporated from history. Then, in an archive in Berlin, Keller unearthed a chilling report from 1946. A French villager had testified that months after the battle, he encountered 3 gaunt men in torn uniforms, wandering near the forest. They spoke German but refused help. He described them as hollow-eyed, muttering about things in the woods. The men vanished before authorities could question them. Could these have been Adler's missing crew? If so, why had they abandoned their commander? And what exactly had driven them to madness? A story that wouldn't rest by the end of 1983. Adler's remains were finally laid to rest in a military cemetery, his sister standing by with tears streaming down her face. But the mystery remained unsolved. Journalists swarmed the story, blending hard fact with speculation. Some claimed Adler's journal hinted at encounters with French resistance fighters, whose guerrilla tactics left soldiers in constant fear. Others insisted that his words suggested something far stranger, that perhaps the foggy forests of Lorraine had concealed horrors that history never recorded. For Greta, the truth no longer mattered as much. She had her brother's remains, his journal, and the knowledge that he had not simply vanished into thin air. Yet for Dr. Keller and his team, the unanswered questions gnawed at them. The mystery of the missing crew, the eerie journal entries, and the intact but abandoned tank. It all painted a picture that refused to be neatly explained. The legacy of a ghost tank, the Panther tank, was eventually transported to a museum, where it became both an artifact and a shrine. Visitors stood in silence before it, imagining the final hours of the crew. For many, it was a reminder of the countless stories of World War II that were never told. The fates of men swallowed by the chaos of war. But for those who knew the full story, the journal, the missing men, the whispers of shadows in the forest, the tank, represented something darker, as Greta herself said in her final interview. History will say he was a soldier who died in battle. But I know, in my heart, Heinrich saw something that no one should ever see. That is why he never came home. The camera lingers on the rusted shell of the Panther tank, now resting in a sterile museum hall. Children peer at it through glass, unaware of the dread its commander once wrote about. The camera then cuts to a dark forest in Lorraine, wind rustling through the trees, shadows shifting between the trunks. A narrator's voice whispers, "Some stories of war remain buried, but when they rise again, they bring with them the ghosts of men who never truly left the battlefield." Fade to black. The forest had finally revealed its secret. The remains of the Panther tank lay embedded in the earth like a giant iron tomb, and within it the skeletal fragments of Commander Dietrich Faulkner still seated in the command chair, as though frozen in the last desperate moments of 1944. News spread quickly. What had started as a private recovery mission by amateur historians now became a story that drew worldwide attention. Newspapers from Germany, France, Britain, even the United States published headlines about the tank commander found after 40 years. But the discovery was more than just bones and rust. It was a time capsule sealed, undisturbed for 4 decades. And inside the tank, objects were found that rewrote the commander's story. The letters beneath the corroded seat and lodged. Behind ammunition racks, searchers discovered a small leather satchel. Inside, miraculously preserved by oil and metal, were bundles of letters handwritten in German, addressed to Martha Faulkner. The ink was faded, but still legible. They were letters to his wife, written during the height of the war. In them, Dietrich spoke not as the hardened commander feared by Allied troops, but as a husband longing for home. Martha, one letter read, "I dream every night of walking through our orchard again, of hearing our little boy's laughter. They call me commander here, but all I wish is to be a husband and father once more. If I do not return, know that my last thought is of you." For many who read those words, the commander ceased to be just another faceless figure in a brutal war. He was human caught between duty and despair, love and destruction. Military archivists pored over the discovery. They retraced battle maps from 1944 and confirmed that Faulkner's tank had been reported missing in action during the retreat from the Allied records noted a skirmish near the Meuse River, where several German tanks vanished under heavy artillery fire. But here's what puzzled them. The Panther was not destroyed by enemy fire. Its hull bore no massive shell impact, no catastrophic blast. Instead, the tracks had sunk deep into marshy soil. The heavy machine had slowly been swallowed by mud until it was trapped. Immovable, experts concluded Faulkner had made a fateful decision. Rather than abandoning his tank and risking capture here, and his crew remained inside, perhaps hoping to escape under cover of night. But the swamp had claimed them. Trapped, without supplies or support, they perished in silence. The survivors, silence in Germany. Word of the discovery reached Faulkner's surviving relatives. His son, now in his late 40s, had grown up never knowing what happened to his father. For years, his family carried the stain of being related to a Wehrmacht officer. They were shunned, suspected, and judged. Now, the truth gave them something else. Closure, but closure came with contradictions. The son admitted he felt both pride and sorrow. Pride that his father's final words revealed a man of love, not cruelty. Sorrow that the war had chained him to a cause he never believed in. For Marta, Faulkner's widow, the news came too late. She had passed away just 5 years earlier, never knowing where her husband lay. She had gone to her grave believing him simply missing. The unearthed watch among the relics recovered from the tank was a wristwatch still intact. Though rusted, its hands frozen in time. The inscription on its back read, "To Dietrich, forever, M." That simple object became the symbol of the story. Journalists photographed it endlessly. For the public, it was no longer about war machines or military history. It was about a man, a wife, and a love story buried beneath the weight of history. The burial, 1984, 40 years after he vanished, Commander Dietrich Faulkner was finally laid to rest. A joint ceremony was held in Germany, attended by historians, local villagers, and his surviving family. The coffin, draped not in military banners but in simple white cloth, was lowered into the ground beside his parents. His son placed the recovered watch atop the casket at the ceremony. The presiding historian said words that echoed far beyond the cemetery. War erases faces, names, and lives. But today, we remember not a soldier, but a man, a husband, a father, a human being trapped in a moment of history none of us can ever fully judge. The forest of silence, back in the Ardennes, the site where the panther had been pulled from the earth, became an unofficial memorial. Locals planted flowers there each year. Travelers would leave small notes, written in many languages, saying, "Never again." For many in the village, the tank had been a ghost, in the soil a reminder of the violence that once consumed their home. Now, with its removal, it felt as though the forest had finally exhaled, releasing a spirit that had lingered too long. The story of Faulkner became part of a larger conversation about the war. It wasn't about glorifying him, nor excusing the atrocities of the Nazi regime. Instead, it became a reminder that every uniform concealed a person with fears, regrets, and unfulfilled dreams. War reduces individuals to statistics, missing in action, killed in action. But in Faulkner's case, the rediscovery of a rusted tank told the world that behind every statistic is a human story waiting to be unearthed. The last letter, but perhaps the most haunting part of this discovery came when archivists translated the final letter found in the satchel. Unlike the others, it was unfinished, cut short, as though interrupted by fate. It read, "Marta, if this reaches you, know that the forest here is quiet tonight. Too quiet. The men look to me for hope, but I find it only in the thought of you. If tomorrow never comes, let our son grow without hatred. Teach him that war is a shadow that consumes." But love, the letter ended there. No signature, just silence. It was as if time itself had frozen in that unfinished thought, carried 40 years in the belly of the tank until someone was destined to read it. As the 20th century closed, many similar stories surfaced. Sunken tanks, forgotten aircraft, missing soldiers, all slowly returned by forests, rivers, and mountains that had swallowed them. Each discovery was a reminder. Wars end, but their echoes never fade. Dietrich Faulkner's story was just one among millions. Yet, in its intimacy in the love letters, the watch, the silence of the swamp pit became a universal tale. A tale that reminded the world that history isn't just written in dates and battles. It is written in whispers, in unfinished letters, in the frozen hands of a watch that once ticked on a soldier's wrist. And perhaps, in the end, the forest kept its promise. It did not reveal Faulkner's secret for 40 years, but when it finally did, it gave the world more than bones. It gave the world a story that would never be forgotten.